This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome to our Shemot series, First Principles of Nationhood. What axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are? How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? These are some of the questions that form the basis of this Shemot series. This week's episode is sponsored in commemoration of the 50th yahrzeit of Pearl Fox Lind, Pesia bat David v'Leah. A righteous woman with little formal learning background, she embodied the principles of Torah in her actions throughout her life, lessons which her daughter and family strive to emulate every day. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch at podcast@matan.org.il or via the Matan office to sponsor Shemot episodes. A brief introduction to our series theme. A first principle is a basic fundamental truth or assumption that serves as a foundation for reasoning or argumentation, what we often call a priori ideas. In many fields, first principles are used to build complex concepts or solve problems by breaking them down to the most essential elements. This phrase is used in the world of philosophy, in the world of science and engineering, and also in problem solving, actually recently made slightly famous by Elon Musk's approach. But basically the idea being that you sort of break down what seems to be a finished idea or a product and try and reduce it to the foundational prepositions or assumptions, and from there try and build a better system. In religion, first principles would typically refer to the foundational beliefs or truths that are considered essential to the faith and from which other teachings, practices, or interpretations arise. This is actually a really interesting idea because within Judaism, we actually famously don't have that many fundamental faiths. But I think that there are many fundamental truths and ideas about how society should function that are reflected certainly throughout the book of Shemot and probably well beyond. And I hope that we will touch upon those in this series. We have moved away, once we reach the book of Shemot, from the family and onto the national plane. Paro is the first to call the Israelites an Am, a nation. Often it is those on the outside who can identify evolutionary change that has overcome another. As God had promised Abraham in the covenant of the pieces, we have proliferated in the land of Egypt, in a land not our own, and become a force to reckon with. However, it will take time and some foundational elements for the Israelites to shed their slave mentality and become the arbiters of their own destiny. The book of Shemot is easily divided into three sections, wherein the people are founded in three stages. First, we have the Exodus. Then we have the Sinai experience, all that comes before and after, with the law-giving and covenant formation. And then we have the building of the Mishkan, with the famous national hiccup in the middle of Parshat Ki Tisa and the building of the golden calf. The movement, the way that Shemot develops, often reminds me of the process of birth. Very often, women and couples gear up for the birth moment, but what they don't really realize is that immediately after the birth, there is an entire life that needs support and formation. While it sounds impossible to understand before one actually has and births that child, the after requires so much more sustained effort than the actual moment of birth itself. When we think about the Egypt experience when it comes to the book of Shemot, it really only takes up the first section of the book. The job of becoming partners with God at Sinai and then building the Mishkan and surviving our biggest spiritual debacle as a nation will be much more complex, it seems, than actually getting out of Egypt. Parshat Shemot opens with a summary list of Yaakov's descendants who come to Egypt. This retrospective glance provides context and appreciation for the intense population growth the Israelites experience in Egypt. We meet the amazing female cast of characters who literally and figuratively midwife the redemption process. The midwives of the Israelites, Moses' mother and sister, and the daughter of Paro, who defies her father's decree and saves a Hebrew boy. Once Moshe evolves, displaying his justice-seeking spirit, and marries Zipporah, God hears the cries of the people and begins the process of removing them from Egypt, now knowing that there is a leader who can actually bring that process forward. Moshe's initial preparation for this mission happens in a prolonged dialogue with God. It is an inaugural prophecy in every classic way, but it is so prolonged because Moshe's disbelief in himself is more elaborate than anyone would have anticipated, and God engages in his doubts each round anew. Moshe has difficulty seeing his own capabilities through the eyes of God and has difficulty grasping grasping how we can ever convince the people that they can uproot and leave Egypt. We meet a set of brothers who get along. Aaron comes out to greet Moshe and kisses him. A younger son outshines an older one, but the older one accepts this division of labor. And for a brief moment before chaos erupts once again, it seems that several important lessons have been learned from the hiccups and difficulties of the book of Breshit. The final section of the parsha brings the people to a point of desperation. After Moshe begins discussing liberation with Paro, he takes a hard line with his slaves and heavies their burdens. The people become angry with Moshe, and Moshe in turn becomes angry with God. The parsha ends with God's promise that the mightiest threat is still to come and that Paro will indeed let the people go. Today, I'm really excited to welcome back Yael Liebowitz, who is currently teaching at Matan and Midrash at Lindenbaum. In 2022, Yael received the Matan Kitvuni Writers Fellowship and has a book forthcoming on Ezra and Nehemiah through Koren Press. To read more of Yael's writing, visit yaelliebowitz.com. Yael, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's really, really great to be back.
I also just want to say, before we sort of get into the depth of the textual and the ideas that we're going to speak about today, that for anyone who isn't familiar with this, other than a wonderful teacher of Torah, you're a phenomenal writer.
Thank you.
And what's unique about your writing is that it's emotional and creative, meaning you also share Torah ideas, but the ones I think that have been most resonant over these past years, and I think probably even some become a little bit famous, I think, from how I see people quoting them, are really, really worth checking out. So anyone who's interested, check out our website or Google Yael and see some of those moving pieces. So really great to have you here, Yael.
Thank you so much. Writing really, I think you would agree, the same goes for teaching. These last few months have been so emotionally both exhausting and also inspiring that it sort of just lends itself to the creative process. But yeah, it's great to be back.
So today we want to speak about, there's so much we could really unpack in Parshat Shemot, but why don't we maybe start with our location, being in Egypt? We start the book of Shemot, and we are, it seems, physically far from our ultimate destination.
Right. So, it's interesting. I was actually just upstairs teaching a class, and we were talking something unrelated, and someone said, we were actually talking about Rachav, who lived in that liminal space between the land, between the desert and the land, and we were talking about this notion of crossing over of thresholds, of being able to sort of, move beyond the liminal space into the place where you actually think you belong. But there's something I think really interesting about our story, is that it actually always begins outside, right? If you imagine this hypothetical scenario, God could have chosen someone who already lived in the land of Canaan, instead of choosing someone from, right, Abraham is the Ivri because he goes over. Or, in the flip hypothetical, God could have kept Avram in the land he lived in, and he could have just made that the promised land. But there's always this sense in Tanakh of movement from the outside or from the periphery to the center and back. It begins with Abraham, then it happens again when the sons move down to Egypt and then have to move back to the land. And there's this, and again, of course, it goes without saying with the repeated exiles, there's always this, on the one hand, threat of living outside the land, and then there's always this yearning to move back in. And that pendulum is constantly swinging in Tanakh, which I think is something very important in terms of knowing, the idea about earning our right to live in the land. But I think
also there's a piece there about journeying, meaning I think that God kind of always wants us to be going somewhere. The Tanakh famously ends, quote unquote, with the word Vaya'al, meaning it's not the end of biblical history, but it's the way that our Tanakh is, I think, very intentionally ends that way, that we kind of always want to be on the cusp of a story that's continuing. And I think that
I would say, meaning the Vayal, I think, though, is towards the land.
That's towards the land. You're saying it's a journey that's heading towards a specific place.
I think I think the journey is, certainly an important component of it. Like you're saying, right? We're never stagnant. But I think there's that constant push and pull between living outside the land and then moving back to the land. The looming threat of living outside the land is on some level always reminding us that in order to live in the center, that right needs to be earned. But I think when it comes to the story of Mitzrayim in particular, again, I think there's something very, very important. It's not just about living outside the land, but the Torah on many occasions repeats the idea. It wasn't just that we lived outside the land, it was Gerim Hayitem, right? And this idea of being outsiders and knowing what it is to be the ethnic minority, knowing what it means to be the Gerim, right? The Tanakh repeats over and over, Lo toneh et hager, you can't abuse, or you can't, the ger in your midst because, right, ki gerim hayitam be'eretz Mitzrayim. There's a sense that it's not just the geographical distance, but it's also the experience of being the underdogs and being the minority and being the oppressed, that when we then become the center and when we then become the majority, we have to be very careful to build a society that really is very cognizant, I think, of that experience.
Right, and famously we have sort of that catchphrase comes up. I think the number is 48, right? 48 times throughout Tanakh of that reminder. Yael Liebowitz, in her introduction to the book of Shemot, emphasizes, she says you don't have to go through any midrashim. Right. She says that. She says it's right there. Right. That was, meaning if we try and understand what's the purpose of the Egypt experience, and this is a topic I did years ago with Dr. Dina Sternberg, but the Tanakh itself tells you that one of the main purposes of the Egypt experience was in order to imbue us with this kind of ethic. When I think about it in the modern sense, about what a lot of the broader Jewish world deals with, I think about the concept of wealth, that in the previous generations, a lot of people built themselves up, right? Yeah, and maybe they were able to build themselves up to a life that was comfortable, sometimes even much more than that, but through that work, they had an ethic of work. And often people are surprised, and this is a topic that's been explored recently, I know, by tradition and other Orthodox institutions specifically, but they're, it's sort of a surprise. Like, why is it that my children don't necessarily have that same ethic? And it's, because there is an advantage to growing up without something and having to work to get towards it. So obviously we're not all going to be going back to be slaves in Egypt, right? But I just want to say that it's difficult to really... It's difficult. One has to think very carefully how to educate for that kind of virtue if it's not inherent in the life experience of somebody when they're younger. And I think that that's like an inherent tension of trying to imbue values in the next generation. If we're not going to intentionally make them suffer, sometimes obviously in like the case of what we're having now, right? We thought we took a generation of people who didn't have those values, and then they were put in a test situation, and we saw that wow, they do have those values. But I think it sits on that same axis of like, can you educate for something that it seems they haven't lived that experience? Right. And maybe it can be dormant and then come out.
If you extend that beyond just the financial context, but if you extend that, going back to what we were talking about with Israel, what you were mentioning, that there was this assumption that the Chalutzim and the people that built, the early Zionists, the people that built this land, they really invested, and everyone else just takes it as a given. And like you said, right, our generation is seeing firsthand that it's certainly not taken as a given by any stretch of the imagination. That goes back, I think, to that constant needing to earn the right to live here, what it means to set up a society, what it Devarim is all, and Shemot also, is all about, the ethical monotheism that we need to use in order to structure a society here, in order to remain. I think you're right. It's that sort of ongoing investment, like you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think also there seems to be, even if these are examples I brought up in the past, so I'm kind of like making them hyperlinks in the conversation, but we're constantly kept on some sort of spiritual tension. We're like a little bit on the edge all the time, whether it's the Torah's approach to power or it's the Torah's approach to reign, right? Yeah. We always want to be a little bit on the edge and things be a little bit difficult. And I'll just a funny anecdote that I wrote on a family WhatsApp last week, and my brother, who lives in a different part of the world, but he has a son who's studying here for the year, and we made some sort of joke in the morning about the sirens that most of us in the areas where we don't constantly have them last week, right? A nice little Yemenite reminder in the middle of the night. And then my brother wrote a comment in the morning like, oh, it's so crazy. I'm like, honestly, like the lice my kids had in the past week was way more intrusive than the
pinworms
than the siren. And my brother said to me, he said, you really do a great job. Of really pitching Aliyah. And I said, I am never a preacher for those things. I said, it's a life lived a little bit on the edge. Meaning I'm using life as a funny example.
But meaning 100%.
It's a thing. There are things that, they leave us on like an edge. And I think that while we can talk about it in the political context of our life in Israel, I think that the Torah reflects that so clearly.
Right. Listen, if you mentioned rain a second ago, right? That's the most tangible example. The whole idea that we don't live in a place like Mitzrayim where the water just overflows naturally and there's always an abundance and you don't have to worry, but that we're contingent on the rainfall, which is contingent on, that brings it back full circle, contingent on our behavior. So like you're saying, there's never we say here in Israel, muvan me'elav, nothing is taken for granted, which I think, like you're saying, is and that goes back to the journey also, right? We're constantly on a journey of trying to make it work, never just sitting in that place and saying we got here. which I think is really key. So yeah, another thing I think that we see, which I think taps into really everything we've been talking about. Part of the reason things aren't taken as a given, and part of the reason we don't take anything for granted, is because our place in this world is not really something that we ever take for granted. And I think something really, really interesting that, you mentioned this is sort of the birth of the nation. And by the way, Ilana Pardes has an amazingly beautiful article on the birth of a nation. She taps into all the different metaphors that I think come to the fore in the story. The blood, the water is breaking and the blood on the threshold. Just really, really beautiful. You should definitely link to it. But I think that one of the things that's really, really important in the story as well that maybe isn't focused on as much is, we look at the isolated women in these stories and we talk about how wonderful they are and all these amazing accomplishments. But I think what we sometimes forget to look at in the sort of bigger picture is how women function as a metaphor wholesale in Tanakh for Israel. Tikva Freimer-Kensky was an amazing she was a scholar. She was an Assyriologist by training, and then she actually taught feminist studies in Chicago. And she wrote a book years ago on women in Tanakh. And she, in the intro, which I think is maybe even the most important part of the book, she talks about how, she came in as a feminist scholar with certain assumptions about what the Tanakh will have to say about women. And then one of the things she came to, which is really, for me, was really changed how I see women in Tanakh wholesale, is she talks about how Tanakh is sort of, I would say, presents or reflects the patriarchal world in which it was written, but it never confuses subordination for inferiority. And that's a really, really important distinction, because subordination was the reality of the times, right? The patriarchs, men were in charge, men held most of the institutions of power were held by men, et cetera, et cetera. But she says, and she comes to this conclusion actually by comparing Tanakh to other contemporaneous literature where women are spoken about and presented and parts of narratives. And she says Tanakh never presents women as inferior to men, meaning the subordination is never condoned or never validated by virtue of who the women actually are inherently. And the reason I think that's important is because one of the things that we see throughout Tanakh is how women are used as the stories where women appear are oftentimes beyond just the story itself, really an indication to Israel, who is the subordinate in any given context, that really power is something that can be grabbed. It doesn't have to be something that's granted, right? If you look at the story in Shemot, what's fascinating is that Paro's whole premise for his genocidal plan is he gets all nervous, right? Right? And what's his plan? He wants to make sure that there's no insubordination, and he's worried about insurrection. And so he says, right, Im ben huva mitenoto v'im bati v'chaya. Right, which by definition means that he's worried about Israel proliferating. He's worried about the potential for overthrowing him. And what he worries most about are the men, and the women are basically innocuous, right? Leave the girls alive, and then what can they do? Which, of course, we realize at the end of the story is the greatest irony. And he does it again when he says, Kol haben hayilod hayora tashlichu, completely ignoring the women in the story. Of course, ironically, it's the women that end up not just subordinating his plan, but it's the women closest to him. There's this sort of inadvertent sisterhood that ends up, sort of coming together. And each time the women are doing what they're doing just because they have, the Tanakh is clear about it with the Mialdot, a moral compass. They were Yirei Elohim, right? They understood that there was a morality, or that there was something above them. In this case, it would be, right, the generic term for God, that was more important, that they had to defer to. That was more important than the tyrannical ruler who happened to be in charge at that moment. And so, you have this story about a tyrant who assumes men are the threat, and then it's the very women in the story that he writes off as completely irrelevant to his plot that end up becoming not just the main characters, but undermining every effort that he makes to destroy the Jewish people, to destroy the Israelites. And I think that in and of itself is something that's really, really important for Israel to hear at the beginning, when we are the subordinate nation, when we are the nation that's powerless and vulnerable and being oppressed, to hear that, that's finite, and that's temporary, and that's something that if you have that moral compass guiding you, and you have the ability to assume that the dynamics and the power dynamics around you are something that can be changed and something that can be subverted, I think is one of the most important messages that Israel really needs to hear.
Right. So if I could just reflect for a moment back on that quote from Tikva, that she really says that the way women are presented in Tanakh are a metaphor, right?
Yes.
They're a metaphor for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Like they are the underdog. They are currently subordinated, but over time, just like again the movement of women throughout, really only in modern history, right?
Correct.
The movement of women in modern history has undergone quite a bit of a change. Now that kind of dramatic change also has happened for the Jewish people in the past, 75 years. So that's it's interesting to think about those changes in parallel. Even within the Jewish state, we have interesting development of the role of women. Like these are two separate stories, but she sort of fascinatingly looks at them as somewhat parallel ones. I think that also, if I can go back for a minute to Paro's thought process, I very much agree with you that he assumed that the women were inconsequential, but I also always assumed that he thought that the women would just marry into the Egyptian families.
So it's definitely possible.
They would be erased, essentially.
Correct. It's definitely possible, and it was a patrilocal world. There's no question.
No, it doesn't negate that. It doesn't negate that.
Right. I'm saying I think the Tanakh, perhaps, right, even if that's the sort of the realistic world in which Paro was functioning, I think, if you look carefully, the words ben and bat appear as milim manchot throughout the text, and it begins with ben, right, Bnei Yisrael, ben, and then it sort of keeps moving, and then the bat becomes more and more apparent. So even if you're 100% right, that was probably his ultimate consideration, was that the women would just marry in, and so the ethnicity of the Israelites would be lost. But I think that still says something important about who he imagined preserves ethnicity.
Yes.
And I also think the Tanakh itself really highlights what it sees as his misconception, by moving from the ben to the bat within that text.
Totally. I think also one of the really salient points in the famous ambiguity regarding the midwives, that we don't know if they're Israelite or they're Egyptian, also, I think, is supposed to give us hope, meaning maybe as a nation, we're supposed to highlight a certain virtue, but it's a virtue that should belong to the world, meaning everybody should be able to have this Yirat Elokim. And of course, that's a play on the Yirat Elokim that wasn't in Breshit in earlier stories. But meaning some of these virtues need to be universal. They have to be universal if the world will function without a tyrannical leader like a Paro. But in theory, to lead that revolution, we have the rest of Shemot, which is that we're supposed to lead that revolution. And one of the things, because I wonder if to say about the women, because I just don't want to forget the pieces I was thinking about as you were speaking, is when you speak about how, but the Torah does not confuse the subordination for being inferior. I think that also what's such a salient support of that idea is that Shirat Hayam has a parallel women's speech, a parallel women's song. And obviously not every single text or every single moment has to be spoken about in parallel. B'diuk, meaning I think a lot we can assume that obviously it was some sort of collective community, but there are these moments where we do have that kind of representation on both sides. In this case, because they maybe weren't going to sing together, but that's significant enough for the Torah to bring that up and to say that they had their own kehillah, they had their own female leader who was doing it with them. And
to carve out their space also, to sort of bookend. It's the women that begin that period in Shemot, it's the women that ends. I mean, I have a whole argument that I think it's the Benot Tzlafchad that really are the catalyst for that final phase, right? They're the first ones that don't say, like, are we going to get in? Do you think it's going to be possible? They're the ones that are like, when we get in, here's what we need to know is going to happen. And so them talking about the future in that, anticipatory way is something that we don't hear until they show up on the scene. And then Sefer Bamidbar, which is really the closing of the Shemot narrative, right? Like you're doing Sefer Shemot, but the Bamidbar, end of the Bamidbar narrative is the closing of the wilderness motif, is, the very, very final thing that the Tanakh chooses to end that whole story with are when the men from the tribe, right, from the same tribe come back and say, whoa, hold on a second. We need to know how it's going to work out for us. So, again, that likely happens in the immediate aftermath of Moshe ruling on Benot Tzlafchad. But by the Tanakh saving that for the very closing narrative of Bamidbar, I think it's, again, similar to the way the Tanakh highlights the bat as the Milah Mancha in Parak Al, in Prakim Aleph and Bet. I think it does the same thing by closing the narrative. And it goes back to what we're saying, to sort of draw our attention or draw into high relief this metaphor that might be lost on us, particularly when we're feeling, like you were saying, subordinate and powerless. But just to go back to your point about the Mialdot and their, enigmatic status, I think, the idea that they could have been Mialdot ha-ivriot or la-ivriot, right? That's the question there in terms of the whether they were Hebrew midwives or just the midwives for the Hebrews. I think that's another thing, we talk a lot about, you and I were talking about how any of this is relevant to our modern experience and to our, I think, there's something really important that particularly in, like you're mentioning, this tyrannical context where a king says, kill all of these people, and all the people under him just do what he says, right? Which we've seen as Jews so many times over the course of history. And we're looking now and we're questioning, is what we're looking at stone, where God is going to say there's no one innocent, or do we have to be like Avraham and argue that no, maybe there is an innocent person left? I think Tanakh consistently, when we are feeling most vulnerable, always puts that other with a capital O, right? The very person who should represent everything that is anathema to Israel and everything that that we warn against, throws that other with a capital O into our story and reminds us that, like you said, it's not just about ethnicity, but it's about the choices we make. And, Yirei Elohim doesn't mean fear of God in a religious way. It means not oppressing the underdog because I know there's a higher authority. So we use it in the context of Avimelech and with Yosef and his brothers. And Amalek, of course, which is anathema to Israel, is the opposite. And that, right? Amalek is not Yirei Elohim, and that's why they came and so I think if you think about all of these critical junctures in history where we are feeling like we're not really sure what's next and we're wondering what the next, it's so often that the Tanakh throws in this other. Or when we worry, I would say even that the world around us is just so systemically evil and filled with evil. And do we even stand a chance because we're this tiny little nation trying, like you said, to spread what Shemot is all about? The Tanakh keeps throwing in, it does it with the Mialdot, it does it with the daughter of Paro, right? The very bat that the man thought was irrelevant, his very own daughter is the one that, in the most ironic pasuk, I think, in all of Tanakh, right? Yeah. That his daughter brings in Moshe into the house and raises Moshe as a son. We have it when Yitro, I mentioned this in that last podcast, when Yitro shows up on the scene, when Rachav, right? You have the Meraglim who are about to enter the land and they don't know what's going to be, and Bnei Israel are standing Ever HaYarden, and there's this woman who behaves more Israelite and has more historical memory than the original Meraglim themselves, right? And I think there's, the last example, you have the story of Ruth, right? There's this sense in Tanakh, don't ever let an Ammoni and a Moavi into your people because they're terrible and they didn't give you bread and water. And then the Tanakh reminds us, in the context of the period of Shoftim, where moral relativism is, where we're at our low, and you have this woman whose only concern is making sure that her mother-in-law, who she has no legal obligation to, has bread and water. So for me, I think, we look around at we were talking about this in a class recently, and someone screams out, Douglas Murray, and she's right. You have this world that you wake up one morning from, maybe I was naive pre-October 7th. A lot of people say I was, I don't know. But I think there was a naivete, and I think we live in a world where we really want to believe that there's more good than evil. And then suddenly something happens, right? Everyone has that before and after. And then you wake up in a world, and all of a sudden, and it's not just in Israel, right? It's the anti-Semitism worldwide. You wake up in this world and you think to yourself, maybe I really was wrong, and maybe the world is more evil than good, and maybe, and I'm not, negating any of those fears, but I think specifically when we have those fears, when we are feeling the most vulnerable, is when Tanakh reminds us with these, and again, all of Egypt didn't change, right? But there was that one heroine who was able to stand up against the tide, and who was able to essentially, again, she was the one that enabled Moshe to be born and raised and everything else. And so, I don't know, I think the Tanakh reminds us when we are most scared not to give up. It almost, I think the Tanakh, I'll say it like this, compels us to remain the Avraham arguing with God, right? It seems like everything is stone, and the Tanakh keeps encouraging us and reminding us along the way. Our job as B'nai Avraham is to keep searching for that one, right? Because that one can make all the difference.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts maybe to add to that. The first is that a conversation about the prototypical other, right? The irony, of course, a lot of times it's a non-Israelite. Right. Okay, right. So that's an interesting piece here. Meaning sometimes we really need somebody on the outside to kind of reflect back to us where we've lost our way.
Totally,
that's one piece, right? Ruth is the Moabite example of showing the Israelites in the period of the Shoftim like where you've gone wrong, and bringing her in is bringing in a positive influence into the Israelite world.
Positive influence, and again, almost like a foil for us. Right? When not enough Jews are returning to the land of Israel, it's Koresh, the Persian king, who says, hey, Ir Hashem et ruach, right? There's this, or he doesn't say those words, right? But he quotes later on, there's this sense that they are almost highlighting for us where we've lost our way.
Yeah. Like so I just want to point out and say that That's a piece that I don't have any clear import for right now, meaning I think that external criticism is important, but I think that if I would take that too directly into our lives in the last year and a half, I think that I personally feel like I would lose my moral sense, because I feel like it's not clear to me that, I can think of a few salient examples, but it's not clear to me like what that voice is on the outside. That's one piece I just want to say.
Okay. Fair.
Meaning,
Right.
I'm not sure. Like, I want to be careful about like over creating that parallel like in my own heart. But
Right.
one piece I want to say, which is not connected to whether it's Israel.
But they do exist. Meaning,
No, of course they exist. Of course they exist. I'm just not sure that, in these stories where we have that example of that person,
Right.
I'm not sure. Again, Douglas Murray is a great example.
Right.
But I think that like in terms of, I'm not sure what other good examples I have.
Listen, I think there are. I think on some, look at, I don't know, what's his name, son of Hamas. He is literally Bat Paro, right? He escaped. And again, I know these are not right? I understand I'm bringing highlights here.
No, and it's okay. They're subversive people within their own space where they feel that things aren't being done properly.
You're saying we don't necessarily have the counter voice to, interesting.
I'm just saying that when I'm careful not to, meaning the direct parallels are important, and I'm also saying that I have a question about who might be our quintessential other with a capital at the moment that can sometimes reflect back to us where we're supposed to be doing better. I hear that. Listen, I think we're also in a place, I don't know, I'll say this, I don't know that in the moment people were able to recognize the role that they, right? It's only in retrospect when Tanakh says, see that person who, so I think we're in a very scared place right now. Yes.
We're in a place where we are literally hunkering down and becoming, again, and I mean, this is no judgments at all, right? But becoming almost more insular from a place of fear, all the things that naturally happen in the aftermath of the collective trauma that we've experienced. But I think what Tanakh is reminding us is to make sure to look for those, right? We may, like you're saying, we may not have the best example, but keep an eye out, because they always appear, and there's never been a time where we didn't need someone from the outside to just nudge us a little.
So Biduk, I think that's a great point. Like, I think we just have to maybe wait and see a little bit longer 100%. To see what that might be. The other thing I just want to say about this quintessential other is that, and you definitely might not agree with this, but I think women historically are the other.
Yes.
And so the fact that the story opens with, there's the clearly powerful men. There's Paro, and then there will be Moshe, even though he himself has to be convinced, right? It'll be Moshe, there'll be Aharon. We have our clearly male leaders, right? We have Miriam is a fascinating change in that dynamic, because we haven't had that, previously. We had the Imahot, and here we have that shifted. It's not about her motherhood, it's stuff about her leadership. But I just think that forgetting what nationality they're from, the fact that women are always somewhat on the outside of those conversations, of that massive plan. And so I think it's very moving, but also understandable that they, whether they're Israelite or Egyptian, thinking about all four of our powerful women at the beginning of Shemot, they're the ones who can say, no, I'm going to subvert this plan.
But there's still a system that they need to subvert.
They need to subvert it. But I think that they're able to do that, meaning I think part of what enables them to, because they're not fully inside the system.
Interesting. That's interesting. They're not fully, how not?
Meaning, again, women, they're not, again, we don't have as much detail about the specific stories, but meaning they are always the ones who have their eye on something slightly different, meaning they have their eye on the survival of the child, right? They have their focus is on something different. They are not in the same position of power as the men around them. And so it sort of enables you to focus on something else in the moment. In this case, it was literally to midwife.
So it's interesting. I'm like blanking on who wrote this article, so I'm like embarrassed that I don't remember the name, but there was an article once that spoke about how, all the deception in Tanakh that goes on, right? The women, the Mialdot, who say, oh my gosh, we thought we were going to kill them, but they just have babies in the fields. We can't get to them, right? So they don't say to Paro, sorry, Paro, we don't agree with your, right? You're a sociopath. They say, no, we don't get, and all, right? If you look throughout Tanakh, most of the acts of deception are women versus men, right? Unless it's a layperson vis-a-vis a king, which goes to exactly what you're saying, right? Yes. Because they are not part of the system necessarily in the same way. There's right? They're not parallel within the system. So they need to figure out a way to tip the scales of power on some level. So this woman was saying that's actually why oftentimes the women are able to outsmart systems, right? Because they're so used to being subordinated within it that they have to come up with other means to sort of work around it. But I will say, in terms of what you're saying, that women were always the other, just to, again, bring it back to sort of modern implications of these stories. I think you're 100% right. And in Tanakh, there's no question, right? We valorize the heroines. We love that Yael was able to stick the tent peg into, but she was still a woman in a tent who, had she not done that, she would have been raped or whatever happened in the aftermath of war, right? So there's always, I think, the question is, and my students have asked this when we teach courses on women, right? So that's great that we're celebrating the few that were able to defy the system, but the system still worked against them. So, I will say, and this goes back also to Tikva Freimer-Kensky's take on subordination versus inferiority. I think if you don't present two different people as being, one being inherently inferior and one superior, so then what the Tanakh is on some level communicating is that we have a system, that system is at play, and that serves as the backdrop for everything you're going to read in this Tanakh, but that system is not fixed, because by definition, if the two human beings are equal, then there's always room for mobility, right? It's the difference between a caste system and what the Tanakh is presenting. And I think the same goes for slavery, right? There's, on the one hand, you have the institution of slavery, but on the other hand, you have the beginning of Bereshit that says all humanity is created equal from one original being, right? Or one original couple. And so on the one hand, slavery might exist, and Tanakh is not looking to, to sort of undo or subvert all of the social realities that existed during its, in its time. But the truth that's communicated in Bereshit, in theory, is what we're always trying to sort of utilize as society is moving forward. I think I don't know how we got there.
Yeah, wait.
Take that out.
No. I just wait. I want to respond, but I also
no idea how we got there. Because you were saying that women are subordinate, but I was going to say, okay, sorry. I'll go back a second.
I'm going to delete this, but can you just give that to me in a sentence? Because I want to respond, and I lost myself.
So I think, just going back to what you were saying, I think when we read these stories, I think one of the things that can be sort of misconstrued or perverted, perhaps, within the modern religious system is that, you see, women were always subordinate to men, so that's how it should stay. And I think Tanakh is saying the opposite, right? Tanakh is saying because women, it's a system, there's an implicit mobility because women are inherently equal to men. So even though patriarchy existed then, that is not necessarily the ideal that should exist eternally. So too with slavery, so too with any other social institutions that existed in the ancient Near East that Israel was a part of. It's not necessarily the ideal. The ideal are the truths that are communicated about the inherent worth of the different human beings that are created.
He doesn't say it in the same words, but I just want to footnote Rav Eliezer Berkowitz's final book on women. I want to say it was called Rituals in Time, but that's not what it's called.
We're both not good with titles today.
Okay, forget what. Well, I wasn't planning on bringing this one in. That he actually says the same point regarding women's status in society. He does compare it to the idea of slavery, and meaning things that were acceptable in society, but over time our moral compass pushes us to shift that kind of structure. So he actually says that he really believes. Now again, it's a book that definitely has leanings that for some might be more liberal leaning than they'd like, which is fine. But I think that the point is a very salient one about systems in society that are. It's very clear to us that slavery is meant to be eradicated. When we open up the book of Shemot, no one would argue that slavery is meant to be eradicated. This kind of hierarchy of power is not something that the Torah supports. As you said, it harkens back to the beginning of the whole Torah. It's very clear. And as you said, the beginning of the whole Torah presents the Char v'Nekeva bara otam, meaning and then when we see a hierarchy developing between them, it's a very negative story. It's a story of blame. It's a story of shaming and discord. And it's not a story we want to repeat. In the same way that we also realize that hierarchy between brothers is not something that we want to keep in place. So that brings us to democracy and Torah. But that'll be.
By the way, I would tweak what you said, and then I don't think it should be offensive to anyone, right? What you said about the Eliezer Berkowitz. It's not that our moral compass in the times of Tanakh was off, and then we've evolved as a people, right? Because then that calls into question Tanakh's morality. I would say Tanakh's morality was always spot on and on point, right? It was just the social fabric of the society of which we were a context that was off, and then I would say society finally caught up with Tanakh's ideals. sense.
Yeah, that's actually what he says. So
Okay.
thank you for bringing that into focus. I appreciate it. Okay, I think maybe our last point for today, maybe let's speak a little bit about Moshe, okay? Because our parsha, while it really starts with these unbelievable stories about the women and all of the nuance points that we've really brought up in the conversation today, it shifts and sort of we end the parsha, in the middle of the action, right? But with Moshe, right? With Moshe, with this, he still does not believe himself. It'll take a whole few more parakim, if not perhaps a whole another book and a half.
I was going to say safer.
Yeah, b'diuk, a book and a half for him to really have that self-faith. But I'm curious if you could reflect with us sort of on Moshe as we meet him.
Yeah, so again, this is sort of al regel achat, but I think all of the personalities that appear in Tanakh are avot, and from everywhere from, all of them it's never just the person who lived. It's what the Tanakh tells us about that person who lived and how that person serves as a paradigm or as a prototype for Israel. I see almost every personality in Tanakh as a metaphor of some sort. And I think in many ways with Moshe, it's I think this actually also goes back to the Lana Pardes article, although I could be wrong about that. So many of the motifs that are similar between Moshe was saved from the water and Israel was saved from the water, and Moshe, there's so many parallels between his life and Israel's birth and then life that goes beyond that. And I think in many ways, Moshe is the leader that really, I would say, embodies the ambivalence that we as a nation felt, right? That sort of ambivalence between do we want to stay in Egypt? Do we want to leave and become our own people, and everything that entails? Everything about Moshe is ambiguous in those early phases. It says, right, Vayigdal hayeled vayitzei el achav vayar b'sivlotam. But is that he knew they were his brothers, or is that the narrator telling us? And then later when Benot Yitro see him at the well, right, they go home and they tell their father, Ish mitzri hitzilanu mi'ad harim. So is he a self-professed Egyptian? Did they assume that by how he was dressed? And, and going back to the women, even though I know you want to move beyond them, it's Tzipora in that moment in the inn when Moshe is, in theory, has accepted upon himself the role of leadership, but still exhibits some form of ambivalence because he doesn't give his son a Brit Milah. And then again, it's that outsider, right? Ironically, again, the daughter of the priest of Midian who makes the cut, right? Which is both figurative and literal, the sort of cut between the life that he lived and the life that he now needs to sort of assume. And I think in many ways, Moshe's ambivalence is so real for Israel. I think had we had a leader who was, born and raised in a Hebrew household and understood everything it meant to be Israel and didn't experience that ambivalence, it would have been very, very hard for Israel to identify, to connect, to feel that he understood where they were coming from. Moshe's sort of that constant push and pull is something that I think made his role in the center and at the head of Israel something very, very real. And that conflict, again, I don't have to tell you, that conflict between, do we want to be the chosen nation and everything that entails and all of the responsibility that comes with, or do we want to go back and sit on Sir Habasar and B'ochlenu lechem lasova? Which life do we choose? And choosing to be the chosen people, or choosing to accept upon us both the honor and the yoke of what it means to be a chosen people is not something it's not an easy choice. And so Moshe feeling conflicted, I think early on, is something that's very empowering by example, I would say.
I think that at the root also of Moshe's conflict is because he was an exiled person within an exile. And I think that is also a really important point that we shouldn't overlook for us as a people, because Moshe had many interruptions in his identity formation, right? Meaning he both is the Israelite not living in Israel, because as a broader group we are now in Egypt. He is sent out of his home to save him and lives in Paro's home. And then he is sent out of Egypt, which was his adopted home, to go and live in Midian. And so he is like a 3-layered exile that he is reckoning with. And I think that when you talk about that as a prototype for Am Yisrael, meaning you went right to the chosen people part, which I think is very much the paradigm that we're sitting on when it comes to Moshe accepting his mission to lead the people. But I think that the level beneath that, the level underneath that is this idea that the identity of Moshe is so complex because he's been sent out of his space. And I think that is also a metaphor, a prototype, whatever it might be, for us as a people, people who experienced that for thousands of years, meaning this idea of how do we uncover what our identity is, and also what parts of those cultures do we want to keep with us. So that's once we become.
That's so funny. As you're saying that, I'm thinking, and in every quote unquote exile that he was in, right? As ambiguous as his identity was, is he Hebrew, is he not? The one consistent, like you're saying, what do we take with us in each context? The one consistent component of Moshe's personality from day one is when he sees two people fighting, he defends the underdog, whether it's two Hebrews fighting, whether it's a Hebrew and an Egyptian. And then even when he's in that, like you're saying, the third layer of exile, he defends the girls who are being, right, sort of harassed by. And so if you're saying what do we take with us in all these exiles, it circles us back to the very beginning of this discussion, which is our ethical core. The idea that we fight for the underdog, that we make sure that there's no such thing as oppressor and oppressed in the world that we are trying to create. Right? That's Moshe's backstory as a leader, which I think is, I think it's really, really critical also.
Your point about Moshe and that the common core character trait is the helping of the underdog, I think that that's a really important point, but it also can be slightly dangerous if we assume that everybody agrees with who is the strong one and who is the underdog. Okay. And I think that we have to be really careful, because when we're dealing with populations or cultures or religions who see things through an utterly different prism than the way we are, then our view of the hierarchy or who has power and who doesn't have power is looked at so differently by them. And we can end up hurting ourselves if we start assuming that our perception of reality is like theirs. So I just want to add that
100%. And the whole, everything going on college campuses and the total, the glorification of the quote unquote victim, even when they're not the victims, everything you're saying I think is completely true. And I think so much of what's, not okay in the, these sort of extreme liberal camps is exactly what you're saying, right?
It's just confusing
confuse the oppressor and the oppressed.
And one person's lens with somebody else's.
Correct.
A Western lens with a non-Western lens. There are two very different ways of looking at reality. And I think that we would be really, really, we do hurt ourselves when we assume that other cultures in the world share the same moral prism that we do sometimes.
No, that's 100%. I'm trying to think of how to. I think everything you're saying is entirely correct. I think the powerful and the powerless have been sort of inverted. I think in many ways, who's the David and who's the Goliath in our story today is also plays out in lots of different levels. I'll say just because the world misconstrues the model doesn't mean that we should let go of the values that we hold dear, right? Yeah. Meaning the world confusing who the victims are in certain circumstances doesn't mean that the ethos of Lo toneh tager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim should therefore be ignored or let go of. I think it's what we need to fight for. Then I would say, based back to what you were saying, is twofold. We need to fight for lo toneh tager, and we need to fight for moral clarity, which is what almost all of Tanakh is also about. Right? Tanakh has very, very clear guidelines for what is considered moral behavior and what is considered immoral behavior. So maybe to hold those two, in equal import, I would say, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yael Liebowitz, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today.
So much fun.
Yeah, really fun I always love being able to speak to other Matan teachers that somehow our lives sort of, we cross paths or don't cross paths here. So I really, really appreciate you coming in and sharing these ideas that are obviously both insightful on the parsha, and I hope also really in conversation with everything that we're going through as a Jewish people in all over the world. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Really.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.